Can you imagine being told to your face that you didn't deserve the home you built with your own two hands? Because that's exactly what my family tried to tell me. They thought if they showed up on my doorstep with a U-Haul and a whole crowd of relatives, I'd just roll over and give my house to the brother who spent his entire life telling me I wasn't even family. My brother shouted, "You're making my kids homeless." I swear, I almost laughed. I just looked around at the small army of relatives he'd brought along, all there to shame me into submission. Then I just said, "If you care that much, one of you can give him your home. Mine isn't available." Honestly, if you'd asked me a year ago who hated me most in my family, I wouldn't have needed a second to think about it. It was Colton, my stepbrother. He's 31 now, just a year older than me. And for more than 2 decades, he treated it like a part-time job to remind me that I was never his real sister. The irony still makes me shake my head. He only started calling me family the day he decided he wanted my house. When my dad married my stepmom Claire, I was 8 years old. I was genuinely over the moon about it. I dreamt about finally having a mom and a big brother, especially since my biological mother had passed away when I was 3. I remember thinking my life was finally about to get better. What I actually got was something else entirely. On their wedding day, I walked up to Colton, holding a small braided friendship bracelet I'd made myself. I'd spent 2 whole weekends on it, carefully picking out blue and gray because those were his favorite colors. I thought it would be the start of something. He looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, dropped it back into my hand, and said flatly, "I'm not your brother. Don't ever call me that." I can still see myself standing there in my little flower girl dress while the adults around us chuckled awkwardly, telling my dad he was probably just nervous. He wasn't nervous. He meant every single word, and he spent the next 20 years proving it. From that day forward, he made absolutely sure I knew exactly where I stood. If a teacher at school referred to us as brother and sister, he'd correct her in front of the whole class. If relatives introduced us together at gatherings, he'd interrupt and explain that we weren't actually related. When his friends came over, he'd point at me and say, "That's just my mom's husband's kid." Not once, not one single time in my entire childhood, did he introduce me as his sister. As a little girl, I kept trying anyway. I'd ask him to shoot hoops with me, to watch movies, to let me tag along to the park. He'd either say no or simply walk out the door without me. I even tried including him when my friends came over, hoping he'd eventually thaw. Instead, he'd invent humiliating stories about me just to get a laugh. Like the time he told half my 6th grade class that I got cut from the soccer team for crying at tryouts. Tryouts I never even attended. Or that I still slept with a nightlight and a baby blanket at 11 years old. Complete fabrications. But he understood something most kids don't figure out until much later. People almost never check. Claire, my stepmom, would occasionally tell him, "Be nice to your sister," and he'd fire back instantly, "She's not my sister." Claire would sigh, tell him to lower his voice, and that was the end of it. No consequences. Ever. My dad always told me Colton was still adjusting to his parents' divorce and needed patience. Apparently, adjusting takes over 2 decades. Things only got worse when my younger half-brother, Owen, was born. Colton adored Owen from the moment he arrived because Owen shared his mother's blood. He'd tell Owen constantly that he had one real brother and one fake sister. Owen was too little to understand what any of it meant, but hearing it over and over eventually made him come to me one night and ask why Colton hated me so much. I didn't have an answer. Nobody did, because nobody in that house ever actually addressed anything. Everyone just wanted peace. And I learned very early that in our family, keeping Colton comfortable mattered more than holding Colton accountable. So somewhere around 13, I simply stopped trying. By high school, we barely exchanged words unless we were forced to. While he was out partying with his friends every weekend, I was stocking shelves and mixing paint at a hardware store, banking every single paycheck. I wanted out. I wanted a life that belonged entirely to me. Colton thought this was hilarious. He'd laugh at me coming home tired on Saturday nights, saying I was wasting the best years of my life while he was actually living his. Maybe from where he stood, he was right. My teenage years were not glamorous. I didn't travel. I didn't buy designer anything. I didn't finance a shiny car I couldn't afford. I worked, I studied, and I saved. After graduation, I earned a scholarship for mechanical engineering, worked night shifts through all 4 years, and walked out with a degree and almost no debt. I landed a solid job designing manufacturing equipment and built my career one careful step at a time. I wasn't rich, but I was completely financially stable before 30. And more importantly, I didn't owe anyone a dime. Every raise and every bonus went straight into savings for a down payment. 4 years ago, I bought my first house. It wasn't a mansion, 3 bedrooms, a small office, a decent backyard, a garage that needed serious work. It was older, but it had good bones, and it was mine. I spent nearly every weekend for 2 years renovating it with my own 2 hands. New flooring, a fully remodeled kitchen, fresh paint in every room, a re-landscaped yard, even a rebuilt back deck that a coworker helped me frame. I watched about 1,000 tutorial videos and made about 1,000 mistakes. But by the time I finished, the place was completely transformed. I was ridiculously proud of it because I had earned every square inch with my own sweat. The first night after the kitchen was finished, I sat on the new countertop with a slice of takeout pizza, looked around at what I had built, and cried a little. Happy tears, the kind you earn. Nobody helped me buy that house, nobody co-signed. Nobody handed me a single dollar. Remember that part? Because it matters for everything that comes next. Meanwhile, Colton's life took the exact opposite road. He married Becca, and he ran a landscaping company that did genuinely good business for a while. Between his contracts and her salary, they should have been comfortable. But comfortable was never enough for Colton. They leased 2 luxury SUVs. They filled a rented house with furniture that cost more than my kitchen remodel. They took extravagant vacations every single summer and posted every minute of them, captioned with things about living their best life. Every Christmas, new gadgets and new toys stacked to the ceiling. Every one of his 3 kids' birthday parties looked like it cost more than my first car. Whenever relatives complimented my house at family gatherings, Colton would shrug and call it cute for a woman living all alone. The one and only time he actually came to see it after my renovations, he walked through every single room without offering one positive word. Then, right before he left, he looked around my living room and said, "Kind of a waste for one person to have all this space. You'll get married someday and move anyway." At the time, I filed it away as just another one of his little jabs. Looking back now, I understand what was actually happening. He was measuring the place. He was already deciding it should be his. We barely spoke after that visit, holidays only, and even then, he'd ignore me completely unless something heavy needed lifting or something broken needed fixing. Funny how I was never family until furniture needed moving. Then last winter, everything changed. Colton's landscaping business fell apart after he lost several large commercial contracts in a row. Instead of downsizing, he doubled down. He refinanced the trucks, maxed out the credit cards, and kept insisting to everyone that one big municipal contract was going to turn everything around. It never came. The business collapsed completely. Creditors seized his equipment. Both SUVs got repossessed within the same month, and they fell nearly 5 months behind on rent. Then one morning, Becca packed 2 suitcases, told Colton she was done drowning with him, and moved 3 states away to her sister's place. Just like that, Colton was unemployed, humiliated, and alone with 3 kids and nowhere to go. After the eviction, he did the natural thing and moved back into my dad and Claire's house. But their house only has 4 bedrooms. One for my parents, one for Owen, who was away at community college but came home on breaks, and one that Claire used as her sewing and craft room. So Colton and his 3 kids got crammed into the last bedroom together. According to my dad, the whole household was miserable within 2 weeks. The kids fought constantly because there was no space. Colton complained about everything: the food, the water pressure, the internet speed. He expected Claire to watch the kids all day while he supposedly looked for work. Months went by with 0 interviews. Yet Claire quietly kept paying the insurance on his one remaining truck because he couldn't risk losing it while job hunting. Every phone call with my dad turned into a long list of complaints about how exhausted everyone was. I sympathized. Honestly, I did, but I stayed out of it. It was not my problem. Then one Saturday afternoon, my dad called and said he and Claire needed to come over and discuss something important. My first thought was that someone was sick. Seriously, that's how grave he sounded. Instead, they sat down at my dining table looking painfully nervous. My dad couldn't even meet my eyes. Claire cleared her throat and said, "We've been thinking about Colton's situation." I nodded and stayed quiet, but the pit forming in my stomach already knew. She continued, "Your house has so much room, sweetheart." The second those words left her mouth, I knew. I knew exactly where this conversation was headed. And I had a sinking feeling it was about to change my relationship with my family forever. Claire leaned forward, her hands folded on my table like she was opening a business negotiation instead of asking me for something enormous. "Your father and I were thinking that maybe Colton and the kids could stay here for a little while, just until he gets back on his feet." I looked at her, then at my dad, who still couldn't look at me. "How long is a little while?" I asked. Claire glanced at my dad and shrugged. "A few months, maybe?" That answer alone told me they hadn't thought any of this through. A few months could quietly become a year without anyone ever agreeing to it. I asked if Colton had found a job yet. My dad quietly said no. "Is he actively interviewing anywhere?" I asked. Another uncomfortable silence. Claire finally murmured that he was focusing on getting the children settled first, which was a curious answer considering he'd been living rent-free with them for almost 3 months. Then Claire finally got to her real point. She said she actually had a different idea, one that might work better for everyone. I knew immediately that I was not going to like it. "Maybe it would be easier," she said, "if you stayed with us for a while instead." I blinked at her. I genuinely thought I had misheard. "Stayed with you?" I repeated. Claire nodded carefully. "Just temporarily, honey. That way, the children wouldn't have to keep bouncing around, and your house already has enough bedrooms for all 4 of them." I actually laughed out loud, not because anything was funny, but because the request was so completely absurd that my brain didn't know what else to do with it. "So, let me make sure I understand this," I said slowly. "Colton doesn't want to stay here with me. He wants me to move out of my own house so that he can move into it." Claire immediately tried to soften it. "It's not like that, sweetheart." "Then explain to me how it's different," I said. She opened her mouth, paused, and closed it again. My dad finally spoke up. "Honey, you're one person. He's raising 3 children." And then Claire added the sentence I will never forget for as long as I live. "Besides," she said gently, "a young woman doesn't really need a whole house to herself. You'll get married eventually and start over somewhere new anyway. Colton needs stability now." I sat there in complete silence for a moment. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the dining room I had spent months renovating. Every cabinet, every light fixture, every floorboard. I had installed them myself. I remembered entire weekends covered in drywall dust because I couldn't afford contractors. I remembered eating gas station sandwiches on an overturned paint bucket because I didn't own a table yet. And now, the 2 of them were sitting at that same table asking me to pack a suitcase and leave, because my stepbrother had decided he deserved my house more than I did. "Did Colton actually ask for this himself?" I said. I already knew the answer before it came. My dad sighed. "It was his suggestion. Of course it was." Claire reached across the table for my hand. "He's under so much stress right now." I gently pulled my hand back. "Claire, he spent 20 years telling everyone I wasn't family." "That was such a long time ago," she protested. "Was it?" I asked. "Because last Christmas, his youngest daughter asked who I was, and he introduced me as Grandma Claire's husband's kid. Not Aunt Ren, not his sister, Grandma Claire's husband's kid. That was 7 months ago. Neither of them said a word. Has he apologized for any of it?" I asked. Silence. "Has he ever once admitted he treated me badly?" More silence. "Has he even called me himself to ask for help?" My dad quietly answered, "No." I nodded slowly. "So, he doesn't believe he owes me so much as a phone call, but he believes I owe him my house." Claire's face tightened with irritation. "Nobody is asking you to give away your house." "Really?" I said. "If I move out and he moves in, without paying rent, without a lease, and without any end date, what exactly would you call that?" She kept insisting it would only be temporary, but neither of them could define temporary. And I knew exactly how this story goes because I'd read 100 versions of it. 3 months becomes 6. 6 becomes a year, and a year becomes impossible to undo. Because by then, nobody wants to be the villain who makes 3 children move again. I'd seen enough. I knew the playbook by heart. So I told them calmly and clearly, no. Not maybe, not let me think about it, just no. My dad's eyes went glassy and he looked down at the table. Claire looked stunned, almost offended, like I'd slapped her. I thought we raised you to help family, she said. That sentence lit something in my chest hotter than anything else she'd said all afternoon. Family, I repeated. That's an interesting word. Where was all this talk about family when Colton spent 20 years announcing to everyone we ever met that I wasn't his sister? Claire looked away. He was just a kid back then. He's 31, I said. People change, she insisted. Have you actually seen him change? I shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing that's changed is that he suddenly needs something I have. My dad quietly asked if I would at least consider letting Colton and the kids move in while I stayed in the house myself. I shook my head immediately. Absolutely not. Why? He asked. Because he would never leave, I said. Claire frowned. That's a very unfair assumption. I looked directly at her. He already believes my house should be his. You don't think that after 6 months or a year, he'd suddenly decide the kids need stability and can't be uprooted again? And then what happens? You'd be sitting at the same table asking me to be patient a little longer because forcing them out would be cruel. Neither of them answered because they both knew exactly how every one of those future conversations would go. The reasonable one always compromises. That had been the rule of our family my entire childhood, and I was the designated reasonable one. Claire finally stood up and smoothed her skirt. I'm disappointed in you, she said. I'm disappointed you even asked, I answered. They left a few minutes later. My dad hugged me at the door, but it felt different, stiff, like he knew a line had been crossed and couldn't decide which side of it he was standing on. Claire walked to the car without another word. I honestly believed that would be the end of it. I had said no. They had heard me. Life would go on. I could not have been more wrong. 3 days later, everything exploded. I was in a design review at work when my phone started buzzing and would not stop. I ignored it until lunch. When I finally checked, I had 19 missed calls and over 40 text messages, most of them from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, some in over a year. The first text read, "How could you do this to those children?" Another said, "I never thought you, of all people, would turn out so cold." A cousin called me heartless. An aunt wrote that she was praying I would find some compassion. I stood in the break room, completely bewildered, reading message after message that made no sense. Then confused, I opened social media for the first time in weeks. Sitting right at the top of my feed was a long, public post from Colton. He never used my name. He didn't need to. He wrote about being abandoned by his wife, about fighting every single day to raise 3 children alone, about being a single father doing his best in a world that doesn't help men like him. And then he wrote about a wealthy relative with a big, mostly empty house, someone who refused to take them in because she cared more about her property than her own blood. He claimed his children were sleeping on an air mattress on the floor because someone who pretends to love this family slammed the door in our faces. That line in particular made my hands shake because no one had ever stood at my door. Not once. He ended the post by writing that he hoped his kids would never grow up to be as cold-hearted as some people in this family. Thousands of reactions, hundreds of comments from complete strangers calling me selfish, spoiled, and heartless without knowing my name, my story, or a single true fact. And the worst part, woven in among the strangers, were my own relatives agreeing with him. People who had personally watched him reject me at every holiday for 2 decades were suddenly acting like I was obligated to hand over my home because he had children and I didn't. I did not respond publicly. I didn't post a single word. Instead, I sat down that evening and took screenshots of everything: the post, the comments, the relatives' replies, the timestamps, every last bit of it. Something in my gut told me this was not over. About an hour after I finished, my phone rang. It was Colton. Against every ounce of my better judgment, I answered. He didn't bother saying hello. "You embarrassed my mother." He snapped. I almost laughed. "I embarrassed your mother?" "She cried the whole drive home because you refused to help us." "No," I replied. "She cried because she finally heard how ridiculous the request sounded when someone said it back to her." His tone went ice cold in an instant. You're really willing to make my kids suffer over some childhood grudge? This has nothing to do with childhood. Then what's it about? It's about the fact that you are asking me to walk out of my own home so you can live in it for free. He let out a long, theatrical sigh like I was a slow student refusing to learn. You don't even need all that space. You live alone. That is not your decision to make. You're being selfish. Maybe, I said calmly. But selfish people usually don't spend 20 years telling someone she isn't family right up until the day they won her house. He went quiet for a second, and then he said the thing that honestly made me smile in the dark of my kitchen. Mom agrees with me. That one sentence told me everything I needed to know about how he saw this ending. He genuinely believed he was going to win because he had spent his entire life winning the moment Claire got involved. Every fight, every rule, every consequence had always dissolved the second his mother decided the peace was worth more than the principle. Unfortunately for him, I wasn't 8 years old anymore, and this was not his mother's house to hand him. I ended the call without another word. There was nothing left to say. If Colton truly believed that Claire agreeing with him would change a single thing, then he hadn't been paying attention to the last 15 years of my life. Claire could be disappointed from sunrise to sunset. Disappointment didn't put her name on my mortgage. I figured he would sulk for a week, post a few more vague things online, and then reality would slowly do its work. Have never been more wrong about anything in my life. The only bright spot in that whole miserable week came 2 nights later, when my phone lit up with a call from Owen at college. I braced myself for another lecture. Instead, my little brother said 5 words I didn't know how badly I needed to hear. I know you said no. He told me he'd seen the post, that he'd watched Colton pull this exact routine his entire childhood, and that he was sorry he wasn't home to say something sooner. He also mentioned, almost in passing, that the family group chat had gone strangely quiet over the past 2 days. Not angry quiet. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I should have, because people don't go quiet when they have given up. They go quiet when they're planning something. The following Saturday, I was out front mowing my lawn when an SUV slowed down and turned into my driveway. Then a second car pulled in behind it. Then a pickup truck hauling a small utility trailer. My stomach dropped before my brain even finished processing what I was seeing. I recognized the SUV. It was my aunt's. And climbing out of the passenger seat in sunglasses and a baseball cap like this was a casual Saturday errand was Colton. Before I could even shut off the mower, doors started opening all down my driveway and people began climbing out holding cardboard boxes. For one truly surreal moment, I thought they must be collecting donations for someone else on the street. Then Colton spotted me, waved like we were old friends, and shouted across the yard, "Perfect timing!" I killed the mower and walked toward the driveway, wiping grass off my hands, completely certain I was misreading the situation. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Moving in?" He answered as casually as if we had planned this together over coffee. I stared at him for several full seconds, waiting for the punchline. There was no punchline. 2 of my cousins were already unloading plastic storage bins from the trailer. One of my aunts was carrying grocery bags toward my front porch, like she was stocking her own kitchen. And then Claire stepped out of the second car, looking deeply uncomfortable, her eyes fixed anywhere but on me. My dad was not there. That was the very first thing I noticed, and I noted it carefully. I asked Colton if he had completely lost his mind. He rolled his eyes at me. Everyone talked it over, and we all agreed this is the best solution for the kids. Who is everyone? I asked. The people in this family who actually care. One of my cousins smiled awkwardly and said they'd heard I had come around after talking things through with Claire. I looked straight at him. "Did I ever tell you that?" His smile evaporated. "Well, no." "Did a single person here actually ask me?" Nobody answered. Boxes hovered midair. Eyes found the pavement. Then Colton stepped in close and lowered his voice. "The way you talk to a stubborn child. Look, everyone knows how you are. We figured once the kids were actually here, standing in front of you, you'd quit acting like this." And that was the moment I understood the entire plan. He had not come to ask me again. He had decided to skip my answer altogether and let an audience do the work. He genuinely believed that if enough relatives showed up holding boxes, with his children standing on my lawn, I would be too embarrassed to turn them all away. He had bet everything on shame. Unfortunately for him, he had spent so many years refusing to know me that he had absolutely no idea who I was. Right then, his youngest daughter tugged on my shirt. She looked up at me with those big, round eyes and asked if she could see the backyard where they were going to live. My heart cracked straight down the middle. And I want to be honest about that because none of this was ever those kids' fault. I knelt down, told her the backyard had a bird feeder and that maybe she could visit it someday. And then I stood up, looked at every adult in that driveway, and made my decision. I walked calmly past all of them, up my porch steps, unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. Through the front window, I watched a driveway full of confused faces looking at each other. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. "Yes, Colton?" I answered. "Open the door," he demanded. "No. Stop making a scene. You're the one trying to move into a house that doesn't belong to you. I'm standing in my own living room." He exhaled hard into the phone. "The kids are out here in the heat. Then you should take them somewhere that actually belongs to you." His voice started climbing. "You're seriously going to do this in front of everyone?" "Yes," I said. "I am." He hung up. About 5 minutes later, loud knocking, then more knocking, harder. Then Claire's voice through the door, asking if we could all please just talk about this calmly like adults. I opened the door just wide enough to step out onto the porch and pulled it shut behind me, positioning myself squarely in front of it so no one could slip past. Claire looked exhausted. "Sweetheart," she started. "Don't," I said. "Don't call me sweetheart while you're standing in front of my house helping someone move into it after I already said no 3 times to your face." Her whole expression fell. She admitted quietly that the plan had been Colton's idea from the start, but insisted she'd only come along because she hoped seeing the whole family together might soften my heart. I asked her one question. "If I showed up at your house with a trailer full of my furniture after you told me no, what would you do?" She didn't answer. Colton answered for her. "That's completely different." "How?" I asked. "Because you don't have kids." And there it was again. Every single argument, no matter where it started, always landed in the same place, as if fathering children automatically entitled a man to other people's property, as if my 12 years of double shifts and drywall dust weighed nothing against his bad decisions. I stepped to the edge of my porch and looked out at everyone scattered across my driveway, still holding boxes like extras, waiting for direction. "Let me ask all of you something," I said. "Did anyone here ask whether Colton offered to pay rent?" Silence. "Did anyone ask whether he'd contribute a single dollar to utilities?" More silence. "Did anyone ask how long he was planning to stay?" My aunt cleared her throat and admitted quietly that they had all just assumed it would only be for a few months. I turned to Colton. "How long?" He crossed his arms. "Until I'm financially stable. However long that takes, 6 months, a year, nothing, 2 years?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because his silence answered for him. And every person in that driveway heard it. There was no plan. There was no deadline. There was only the expectation that once he got inside, getting him out would become my problem, my legal fees, my reputation, my fight. I looked directly at my 2 cousins still holding his boxes. "You both carried those up here because you believed I had agreed to this." I never agreed. I told my dad and Claire no 3 separate times, in person and in writing. Colton knew that when he called you. Both cousins slowly lowered the boxes back onto the trailer. One of them muttered an apology and wouldn't meet my eyes. My aunt's face had gone pale. She turned to Colton. "Is that true?" Colton went instantly defensive. "Hands up, she's twisting everything, that's what she does." I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I simply pulled out my phone, opened the text conversation with my dad from 10 days earlier, and handed it to my aunt. The messages were right there in plain black and white. My dad asking me to reconsider. Me refusing. My dad asking again 2 days later. Me refusing again in complete sentences with no ambiguity anywhere. No misunderstanding, no mixed signals, just the word no over and over politely and clearly. My aunt read the whole thread in silence. Then she looked up at Colton for a long moment, handed my phone back to me, and without saying a single word, picked up the grocery bags she had set on my porch and carried them back to her car. That was the moment the tide turned and everyone felt it. One by one, relatives began quietly loading everything back into the vehicles. Nobody argued with me anymore. Nobody asked me to reconsider. Nobody would even look at Colton because every single one of them had just realized the same thing at the same time. They hadn't come here to help a desperate father. They had been recruited as props in a pressure campaign, and they'd been lied to about my consent to get them into their cars. Colton watched his audience dissolve, and he completely lost control. He started shouting that everyone was abandoning him, that his own family was leaving him homeless. He called my cousins cowards. He accused me of orchestrating all of it, of humiliating him on purpose in front of his children. He even turned on Claire and screamed that she'd never once fought for him like a real mother should. And that's when something happened that I never in 30 years expected to see. Claire raised her voice louder than I have ever heard it in my entire life. Enough! The whole driveway went dead silent. Even the kids froze. She turned and looked directly at her son. She told us no, weeks ago. I should have respected that the first time she said it. This is over. Colton stared at his mother like she had spoken a foreign language. You're taking her side! Claire closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, she suddenly looked every one of her years. I'm taking the side that's actually right. For the first time since I was 8 years old, the reasonable person was not being asked to surrender to keep the peace. It had only taken 22 years and a driveway full of embarrassed relatives for her to get there. Colton looked around, waiting, genuinely waiting, for someone to step forward and defend him. No one moved. My cousins loaded the last boxes without a word. My aunt sat in her car with the door shut. Even his own children stood quietly by the trailer, sensing that something enormous had just shifted. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He doubled down. He pointed his finger at me and shouted that I had turned everyone against him, that I'd been waiting my whole life for revenge because he'd never accepted me as his sister. And I almost laughed, because after everything, he had finally accidentally told the truth. You're right about one thing, I said. You never accepted me as your sister. And that's exactly why none of this makes any sense. He frowned, thrown off. I kept going before he could recover. For over 20 years, you told everyone I wasn't family. You corrected teachers. You corrected relatives. You corrected your own children when they slipped up and called me Aunt Wren. We worked hard for decades to make sure not one person on this earth thought of us as brother and sister. And then the very second you needed a free house, suddenly I'm family. So, which is it, Colton? Am I your sister or not? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. 22 years of certainty, and he could not produce a single word. That's what I thought, I said. Right then, my dad's car pulled up along the curb. He'd been at the grocery store, and judging by his face as he stepped out and took in the trailer, the boxes and the silence, he understood immediately that everything had gone exactly the way he'd been afraid it would. He walked straight to me and quietly asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, but that this could never, ever happen again. He nodded. And then he did something that honestly surprised me more than anything Claire had done. He turned to face everyone still standing in my driveway and told them the truth out loud. He said that he and Claire had asked me to reconsider multiple times and that I had clearly refused every single time. He said I had never given anyone any reason to believe Colton could move in. And most importantly, he said that letting Colton believe otherwise had been their mistake, his and Claire's, not mine. Hearing my father say that in front of the whole family changed the air completely. The last few relatives who had still looked unsure suddenly understood the full picture. Colton hadn't misunderstood my answer. He had heard it, ignored it, and bet that enough public pressure would break me. My oldest cousin shook his head slowly and said, "Colton, you told us she'd agreed." Colton didn't deny it. He couldn't. Instead, he started crying. Real tears this time, not the performance from the phone call. And for one brief moment, standing on my porch, I genuinely felt sorry for him. Losing your business, your wife, your home, all in 1 year that would break almost anyone. Then he wiped his face, pointed at me one last time, and screamed that all of this was my fault. That if I had just acted like family for once in my life, none of it would have happened. And whatever sympathy had been forming in my chest evaporated on the spot. I looked past him at every adult in that driveway and asked one final question. The same question I've been waiting to ask since the first box came off that trailer. If any of you truly believe he deserves a free house, why hasn't a single one of you offered yours? Nobody spoke. Not one person. My aunt studied her steering wheel. One cousin mumbled something about his lease not allowing more occupants. Another said they already had 4 kids of their own at home. Every excuse was perfectly reasonable. Every single one of them had a completely valid reason why their own home was off the table. They just couldn't explain why mine wasn't. 10 minutes later, every box was back on the trailer. Every door was shut, and every vehicle backed out of my driveway one by one. Colton climbed into the last car without looking at me. A man who had arrived with an army and was leaving without a single soldier. And as the trailer disappeared around the corner, I stood alone on the porch of the house I built with my own 2 hands, turned the key in my own front door, and walked back inside. The silence was deafening, but this time it felt like peace. I want to know, if you were in my shoes, faced with an entire family trying to shame you into giving up your home, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below.